Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into an absolute logistical nightmare, conquering a massive, completely unfamiliar territory and then actually managing to keep it. I'm your host, and we're going to decode the intricate administrative web of the Delhi Sultanate. Because, let's be real, establishing a kingdom is one thing, but keeping tight control over the vast Indian subcontinent, yeah, that took a whole lot more than just a powerful army.
I mean, just put yourself in the Sultan's shoes for a second. Your survival doesn't just depend on your swords. It depends on your ability to build a massive administrative machine, one that can project your power all the way from the capital out to the most distant, unruly provinces. Sure, a military victory might win you a city for a day, but it's the tax collectors, the judges, and the bureaucrats who actually hold an empire together over the centuries.
Section 1. Building a Medieval Empire. So let's look at where the sprawling bureaucracy actually came from. The Ilbari Turks definitely didn't invent their system from scratch. When they set up shop in Delhi, they inherited a really rich blend of traditions. They drew heavily on Abbasid and Persian models for the Wazarate, which is essentially the prime ministry, and the Iqta land system. On top of that, they adopted a brilliant decimal army organization from the Ghaznavids, plus gourd traditions of governing by tribal consent. But their true genius, that was taking this entire Central Asian melting pot and adapting it perfectly to the unique, on-the-ground realities of India.
Section 2. The Sultan and his court.
Okay, to really understand this system, we have to start at the absolute center of gravity, and that is the Sultan himself. He was the node of the entire administrative apparatus. We're talking absolute military, administrative, and legal power, heavily concentrated right there in the capital city. He was the supreme executive, and the capital itself was specifically designed to sustain the vital non-agricultural classes, the soldiers, the artisans, the nobles, who absolutely needed to live close to the ruler.
Now, this setup created an incredibly delicate balancing act for the Sultan. On one side, you've got the nobility. These were the military power players who literally had the armed strength to select or depose a ruler. On the flip side, you have the ulema. They were the theologians and judges, acting as these socio-moral censors of the time. And because the Sultan ultimately had to prioritize political pragmatism over strictly enforcing religious laws just to keep the empire running, the interests of the Sultan and the ulema clashed constantly.
There's this famous warning from the Wazir to Sultan Iltutmish that just perfectly captures their reality. He said, "Muslims in India are like salt in a dish." It's such a vivid image, right? The ruling elite was just a tiny, tiny minority. They literally could not rely on sheer numbers to stay in power. They had to rely on a vastly superior administrative system.
Section 3. The Central Ministries.
To maintain this delicate control, the Sultan relied on massive central ministries. Honestly, think of this structure like a modern mega-corporation. You had the Diwaniyars handling all things military and defense. Then there was the Diwani Insha, totally focused on drafting state communications and royal orders, and the Diwani Riyasat, which kept a strict regulatory eye on the markets, supplies, and weights. But the absolute most important department of all, that was the Diwani Wazarat. The head of this department, the Wazir, essentially acted as the prime minister and the chief financial officer rolled into one. He was the primary advisor to the ruler, he tracked every ounce of state income and expenditure, and crucially, he supervised all the payments to the massive army. And when your army is your main tool of enforcement, the person holding those purse strings holds an incredible amount of power.
Section 4. Controlling the provinces.
But what happens when we zoom out? What about those distant outer provinces where the central sultanate's control was at its absolute weakest? Well, this brings us to the Iqta System. The central state simply didn't have the bureaucratic reach to micromanage every distant town, so they handed out territorial assignments called Iqtas to their administrative officers and nobles, known as muktis. Basically, instead of a direct cash salary from the capital, these officers extracted their own pay from local land taxes. In return, they were required to maintain troops for the Sultan. This built out into a highly structured, cascading chain of command. Right at the top, provincial level, you had the mukti or wali. Below them, the province was divided into smaller units called shiks, run by a shikdar. Those broke down into parganas, and finally down to the individual village level. And what's really fascinating here is that as we move down this hierarchy, the administration actually shifts from centrally appointed Turkish nobles at the top to indigenous, pre-existing local authorities at the bottom. Because those outer provinces were vast and famously unruly, the Sultanate heavily compromised. They essentially formed pragmatic partnerships, integrating local Hindu elites like Rajas, Ranas, and village headmen, and allowed them to continue managing local administration. The deal was simple. As long as these local rulers recognized the supremacy of the Sultan and regularly sent tribute, they were largely left to their own devices. But as you can probably guess, delegating that much power to distant commanders was incredibly risky. Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq highlighted this perfectly. He noted that provincial commanders often use their sheer distance from the capital, along with their locally funded troops, to rise up in rebellion, driven by anger and a love of plunder. The very system that was designed to control the provinces was constantly threatening to tear the whole empire apart.
Section 5. Military and Money. So to suppress these constant rebellions and keep the whole machine running, the Sultanate relied on two final pillars: a highly structured military and massive revenue extraction. The army itself was brilliantly organized using a base 10 decimal system borrowed directly from the Ghaznavids and Mongols. This meant 10 horsemen reported to a sarkhail, 10 sarkhails reported to a sipah salar, and so on. This mathematical hierarchy made these massive armies remarkably modular and surprisingly easy to command. But look, a massive army is completely useless without strict discipline. The central government ensured accountability using some pretty ingenious tools. For example, Dog, which literally involved branding horses with the royal insignia, so corrupt commanders couldn't swap out good war horses for weak ones. They also kept hulia, or detailed physical descriptions of the soldiers, to prevent fraud. Later rulers like the Khaljis and Tughlaqs even started bypassing the Iqta system entirely, paying soldiers directly in cash just to guarantee absolute loyalty. Now, you might be wondering, where did all that cash actually come from? The farmers. This entire massive military and administrative apparatus was funded completely by agrarian sweat. The state heavily extracted surplus wealth through taxes, primarily the kharaj, which was a hefty tax on agricultural land. They also collected the jizya, a specific tax imposed on non-Muslims in lieu of military service. And they took this extraction very seriously. At the absolute height of its centralization under Al-Din Khalji, the state didn't just guess what a farmer owed. They implemented hukmi masahat, which is the actual physical measurement of the land, to precisely determine the anticipated yield. Through this intense level of surveillance and assessment, the state could extract up to half of the total agricultural produce, all just to feed the capital and fund those massive armies. Ultimately, when we look back at the Delhi Sultanate, their true legacy wasn't just in the massive amounts of land they conquered. It was in the incredibly intricate, enduring web of administration they wove across the subcontinent. They took Persian and Central Asian models, blended them with local Indian realities, and created a complex, cohesive network that kept a tiny ruling elite in power for centuries. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a thought. When you consider exactly how this relatively small group of people managed to govern millions across such vastly different terrains, ask yourself this: is the ultimate weapon of an empire its military might, or its bureaucracy? Was it the swords that truly built the Sultanate, or was it the spreadsheets? Thanks so much for joining me to explore this fascinating slice of history.